My history with platformers started all the way back from a Game Boy Advance cartridge port of the original Super Mario Bros. My mum had shown me the warp zones and I would always use them to quickly get to World 8. And over the years growing up, I would touch upon a number of other platformers like Castlevania, Hollow Knight, Cuphead, Shovel Knight, and Super Meat Boy. It's a genre I enjoy and simultaneously hate at the same time. The insta-death spikes, touching an enemy counting as a hit, the jump button not always working. Platformers in general frustrate me more than shooters do, and yet I still come across them at least once every year, and playing Castlevania is always a blast. But for the longest time, the genre has had this mentality that metroidvania style maps are the only type of platformers to exist, and to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of metroidvanias with some exceptions like Symphony of the Night, Super Metroid, and Hollow Knight. When it comes to platformer games, I prefer the classic layout, where you go from start to finish. And I have here one platformer that does exactly that. But in the most metal way possible. Slain Back from Hell. Slain Back from Hell is an old school platformer indie game heavily inspired by the original Castlevania trilogy, as well as heavy metal music. Originally released in 2016 by Wolf Brew Games. But the launch was a disaster and reviews were not favourable. Eventually though, it would get released again as Slain Back from Hell, and this time the reception was a lot better. And the same can be said for the game itself too. Like its main source of inspiration, you kill your way through the various monstrous hordes across a decrepit gothic medieval wasteland with nothing but your sword, your long hair, and your magic spells that you use to get from the next level to the other. The story is that you're a man woken up from his eternal slumber by a spirit who gets you to go up against the big bad vampiric lord called Vrol. Basically, this game's Dracula but with a twist. From that point on, you go into this forsaken realm and you start hacking in 2D platformer fashion. Just to get it out of the way, and since it's the first thing that you'll notice immediately when you play this game, I've got to say it. This game looks metal as fuck. The art team must have went wild with this one because these are some of the best backdrops for a platformer I have ever seen in a game. You take the gothic medieval architecture from the Castlevania games, the horror-like monstrosities and atmosphere, but update it with the equivalent of a death metal album cover. Seriously, go look for some covers on the internet within the genre and you'll see exactly what I mean. From the color palettes, the animations, the designs of the monsters, as well as the backdrops all together all scream metal, and really nail the dark fantasy theme that the game has going for it. There aren't a lot of levels, but they're lengthy and further lengthened by the fact that this game is really hard. The Castlevania games, as well as other games from the 80s and the 90s, were in reality short, but were incredibly difficult so that you would be spending hours anyway just to try and finish the game. Veterans and speedrunners can beat these games with ease due to experience, but in the beginning it took an eternity for all of us. Nowadays, games are in the middle, easy in terms of accessibility and are fairly lengthy for the most part, but games like this are an echo of a time where shit was hard and victory had to be earned. And so, what about the rest of the game? It's pretty much like the old school Castlevania games. You have your main attack from your sword and a ranged attack that you can either charge into a bigger projectile or crouch to do a huge explosive spell attack. You can also get a flame sword as well as an icy axe later on that also work against different sorts of enemies. The enemies themselves have different weaknesses to certain weapons, but eventually you'll be able to identify those weaknesses and switch on the fly. You can block as well to minimize damage, but what you'll want to nail in order to make the game more manageable later on is parrying. Parrying is done by pressing triangle just before the attack lands, or when a projectile can be struck back. At times it can be pretty overwhelming, but don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to practice in these levels because you'll be dying over and over and over again. When I said this game was difficult, I wasn't lying. The placements of spikes, traps, and annoying enemies like these guys, you'll be getting hit just about all the time. It is possible to beat the game without dying. In fact, there's an achievement for it. There's even achievements for beating the bosses without taking any damage. But I'd say it's more of a matter of patience rather than practice, because platformers are not the type of games you want to be playing for too long. In any case, the monsters generally have one attack to give, and you eventually learn to memorize their patterns. The bosses have more to work with here, and they're also really hard. They have different variations of their attacks where they start to kick in after you deplete more of their health. You will, however, die a lot learning how to deal with them. But they're not impossible to the point where they're unbeatable. An experienced platformer gamer will be able to beat this game in a day or so since it's actually pretty short. The music itself is fine, it's metal that fits the game's theme, but it doesn't necessarily win me over in the way Castlevania's music does. I like my metal, but this one just didn't really do it for me personally. The rest of the game makes up for it, however, especially in the art department, which is the game's biggest strength. The world and setting of Slain Back from Hell is beautiful in a dark and twisted form. The animations bring everything to life and the color palettes are quite nice. Levels like the Wolfwood, as well as the level before the final boss, are just laced with atmosphere. It honestly feels like you're living in a death metal album cover, unapologetically medieval and bloody. Games like this are the reason why 8-bit to 16-bit games in both the retro and indie realms still hold up incredibly well today, because the limited capacity of the graphics made appealing art styles a priority in the game development. And Slain Back from Hell is proof that you can be retro and still look great at the same time. It's just a shame I can't see more of it because there aren't that many levels. I'm glad that the developers and the publishers of this game didn't leave it in the dust the first time around, because it was something right up my alley during a time where I was looking for anything remotely similar to Dark Souls. Even if it was a 2D game, I would have played it. Slain Back from Hell has some aesthetics from Dark Souls, but it is far more like the classic Castlevania games, and I think it does a great job of being that. It's a hell of a frustrating game though, and you'll die pretty often to the stupidest of things. But if you're looking for a retro platformer that will turn your balls into a pincushion like the way Castlevania 3 does, then Slain Back from Hell is a worthy platter to your plate. Get your sword, and bathe in the blood of your foes in honor of the metal horned god. Thank you for watching.